Can you see this? Vulnerability and risk. Kita ninyo? Hello?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
sir.
let us start. So, welcome to our another session, a live class session on DRR. And today, we will continue to talk more about vulnerability. And we also now go to risk assessment after the vulnerability assessment, which we started last week. So let's start with a prayer. You can pray with me or you can just stay silent. In the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, holy be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Do not bring us to the test, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Okay, so these are our netiquettes, no? Some reminders. I hope you are dressed well there for class today. We also ask you to turn off your mic when you're not speaking, but of course you are encouraged to discuss with us, no? To share your points as well, so that we can learn together. Sige. So as I've said, today we continue our discussion on vulnerability. So that's why I call it Vulnerability Plus. There are some more details and some more tools that I will introduce so that you can probably choose one of them for your midterm exam. Then let us already start doing risk assessment, which is actually a continuation of the vulnerability assessment last week and some reminders. Okay. So before we do the recap, let me just admit some. Okay. And may I ask you all to turn on your cam just to check if you are really there, listening to class. May buntag, Emery. May buntag, ito na nagawas kiyan.
Sir, wala ko ikam, sir. Gigamit sad sa akong manghod, sir. Nag-klase sad sila.
Okay. Sige. Sunod, ikaw na pud mo gamit ha. Siya na sa dili. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Sige. So, good morning everyone. Energy level, we? Okay. Discuss na sa takaron. Masigwa tayo energy. Energy level? From 0 to 5. Ang sud sa ng 0, no? Nakamata pa kanya na 0. 2. Luya man kayong ban. 3. Sige. Let us try to excite this day. Okay, so I will now start my lecture. You can turn off your cam, but I'll just turn on my cam. No? But I don't know. I think when I start sharing my screen, my cam is lost. But anyway, let us start the lecture part. As I've said, you can ask questions anytime. If there are questions, so you can please interrupt me, especially if there are classmates that are knocking in, no? And I cannot see it while presenting. Okay, so good na ta. Makita ni ninyo kining 1, 2, 3? Kita ba? Sige, padayon ko. Okay, so thank you, ano. So just a recap, no. Previously, since I think week 2 or 3, we really have been talking about this framework called HEVR. And we say that risk can happen if there is hazard, and that's why in your prelim you characterized hazard. Of course, you have to choose what exposed elements are you interested in, or what group of people or system you are studying. And finally, last week we talked in detail about vulnerability and capacity, and we introduced some tools, no, so that we can, if we understand vulnerability, then we can probably reduce vulnerability, and in effect, no, we can also reduce the risk that we are talking about. So as we said, no, vulnerability are conditions determined by the gansya part, no, physical, social, economic, even environmental, or even processes which increase, di ba, kung vulnerable sila, na susceptible, no, prone dayon ang individual or ang system to the impacts of hazards. So muna tungod kay daghan kayo ang kinahanglan i-consider, we need to have tools, no, to help us determine and understand vulnerability. So as I've said, we call that vulnerability assessment. So it's a process, no, of estimating this susceptibility. Mo na siyang assessment, which is the process. And ang next, di man magawas na next na here. So that's when we introduced systems thinking, because the problem now is wicked as we describe it, because it's not just straightforward solution, because there are many stakeholders here, there are many concerns and many parameters to consider. So in order to understand and hopefully untangle this wickedness, we need to do systems thinking, no, approach to understand this problem. And so that's why last meeting we had some examples. I was saying this is a risk to failure of functional local health system in CDO that we have been working. And there are also some examples done by cities, no, that we have trained in Cagayan and, for example, in Iriga. So, of course, no, it can be so complicated because this is the reality. It's not to overwhelm us, but this is really the reality. And that's why it's hard to solve these problems, because it is not just straightforward. There are many concerns that we need to consider. As you said, we may not be able to completely solve the problem, but if we are able to map out, no, kung makita na to which one is connected and which one will influence the other one, then we may have hope, no, to at least slowly, step by step, try to intervene. And when stakeholders see this, kana bang imong ka group member makita nga, uy, involved man di ko, affected man di ay ko, kay kung dili ko magingani, appeal man sa di ay ko. Dinha then ang connectivity will have a good promise, because it will cascade, no? The impacts, the negative impacts may cascade, but the good promise, no, of having this solved will also cascade, as we have seen in the video later on. We'll try to reflect on that. Okay. However, as we said, there are also simpler models, no, that we can, or tools that we can use, like the iceberg model, no, or the island model, where we just identify the four elements or parts, with the events, the patterns, and we try to answer these questions. So here, no, mo ni ang mga example, kung kini very personal nga example nga giubo lang ka, or kini katong nagbaha gyud ang usa ka lugar. So there are also we can also use these tools, no. Although the systems mapping, systems thinking tool is more comprehensive, because we really see all the connection. Here, you may not have the map, but of course you can still articulate. Okay, let's continue. Other than that, we also have the crunch model, no, or the pressure and release model, as I have explained it to you. So you can also opt to choose this for your midterm exam, no, in analyzing the vulnerability, where there are other the unsafe conditions which we actually see. There are dynamic pressures and root causes, and this is the progression, no. This is how our vulnerability progress, that will crunch, no, or that will make a pressure here, and kaboom, mo din nga na disaster nga mahitabo. Of course, there's also hazard which you need to characterize. Of course, when we all, the point, no, of having vulnerability analysis is to understand why is this happening. And so that's why later on, after midterm, we may want to already use the release, no, the after the pressure, the release model, by looking at what is the opposite of what's happening in society or in the environment, for example. So para ma-release na to, wala na din crunch. But of course, we do this only after the midterm na. For now, let's just go up to the crunch, no, or kining pressure model. Makitaan ba ninyo, by the way? Sinawala akong slide. Can you see this slide? There are 4 small slides.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Padayon ta. So, I gave you an assignment, no, wala na ako nahuman og basa tanan, very interestingly, and yung mga answers on how wolves change rivers. And I hope you had a good time, no? Not just fun, but also an insightful experience in watching that 7-minute man siguro nga video on the cascading effects, no? And we see really the systems, no? Connectivity, interconnectivity, and therefore probably the synthesis, no, on how the world is, the natural world is actually functioning, no, kato kay natural world magyud to. In fact, no, if you try to search the internet, there are several. For example, this is a mind map, no, basically a systems map on how wolves will, example, will kill some more deer, and therefore that will affect the vegetation, and therefore the vegetation will affect the river, etc., etc. So kini, no, this is an attempt of showing the connectivity of how wolves could change the river. And of course, I'm sure in your mind, no, even if you did not draw it like this, I'm sure it has passed through. The thought, no, has entered your mind. And there are some, no, who can be more kanang complicated ang ilang connection. As I've said, it is also good to place arrows or direction as to where it goes, di ba? Kana unsa ang ma-affect niya or ma-influence or ma-impact niya. Dili lang akin ninawagan sa ni arrow, di ba? So here, for example, again, the wolves prey on the deers, and then they go to the aspen, to the woods, and then finally to the rivers. And of course, no, there is even more after the river is changed. Then akong question, di ba, sa inyo nga, then unsa kang pwede pa ma-change, di ba, after the river. And I had good time, no, reading your assignment. These are some, no, as I've said, we can also, these are some examples, no, where there are reinforcing and balancing elements. So kini lahi sa other than arrow, napay ikuan niya nga maka-reinforce or maka-balance sa imong system. You know, for example, sa balay lagi, kung imong tapakan basin ma-reinforce siya, no? Or kung imong i-repair gyud ang sementuhon nimo or imong masahan og utro, so ma-reinforce siya. Pero kung imong pasagdan, imong i-neglect, unya dugangan pag yun mo nimo load, mo samot og crack, so mo na mo balance dayon, mo balance sa iyang kalig-on or mo reinforce ba sa iyang dili kalig-on. So here, wolf population will reinforce the ecosystem and things like that. No, or wolf population will actually balance the deer population. Of course, kay mukaon man sila sa deer, and therefore kining connectivity to the ecosystem will also balance. There are even some, no, naay ka ng mga software na gali ani called Vensim, no? So pwede sad ngingon ani, no, gyapon reinforcing, etc. And some more examples here, no, subsystems. Part lang wala pang river din but na, no, mga plus minus because it could also change, no, kay ang pasabot lang ni ani nga pwede gyud nga kung gamay ra ang wolf, so mudaghan negative ang iyang effect paingon sa elk or something like that. But finally, what we want to connect is with the human world, no? And that's why I will still have to finish reading some of your assignments, no? That if this is Yellowstone, what about this is the Cagayan de Oro River Basin in Kalatungan and in Kalatungan and Kitanglad, unsa man yang impact diri sa kuan, no, Cagayan de Oro kung magbaha na siya, no, kung ma-change na to ang river. So pwede gid ang connectivity ingon ana klase, no. But of course it can also just happen within your neighborhood. So mo na siya ang atong assignment, and I hope as I've said, no, you did not just learn but also had insightful experience watching the movie. But of course, there are more. No? As I've said, napay daghan tools good on vulnerability assessment. And I'll just show you some. But of course, you can just explore them mga mas simple and more creative way. So examples here, no, na yung mga pila ka book here. We call this as participatory risk assessment. And probably if we have time next meeting, I could give you some example or share some experiences that we did, no, in XUERC. So mo nang PRA, no, kay participatory risk assessment gyud, no. So naay di lang mga scientists gahimo na gyud ang mga example gapuyo sa barangay, di kapuyo dito sa bahonon ng area, you can actually also invite them. Of course, some steps to do that, you have hazard mapping which we already did for your prelim. And if you do not have map at that time, no, when there were no hazard hunter, when we did the mapping for the 40 barangays in the assessment for 40 barangays in CDO, we do transect walk, no. Basically mura ni siya reconnaissance, no. If you remember in your surveying, before ka mag-adto sa field nga magdala na immediately sa imong mga kuan kanang mga gamit kanang sa imong mga transit or theodolite, for example, or total station, you would need to go around first, no. Magsusi sa ka ba, maniid sa ka nga pwede siguro diri mo tindog ang transito, dili bangilid dito mo sakay nga na. So that's what we call transect reconnaissance, no. So basically a transect walk is like reconnaissance, but it is more in depth, no. If there are people, then you can also ask them questions, things like that. So magsuroy lang ka, no, para makabalog ya unsa gyud ang tinuod ga kahitabo diha nga area. We can also do seasonal calendars to indicate unsa man siya, yearly ba ni kahitabo or every 30 years lang, every 100 years, or basin kada gabi lang ni siya ingon ana. So naay mga ana nga example which we also did. Of course, livelihood is important so that we understand if ngano dili maka-afford ang mga tao. Of course, Venn diagram from statistics. Some will even do a drama, no? When we were in face-to-face, we do this in class, no? Ga community drama sad me. And sometimes we also do problem tree or ranking or a fishtail analysis. Here's an example, no? This is from Oxfam, UK, no, nga organization. So iya mo lang siya nahimog problem tree ba. Pwede sa ni siya gamiton ninyo, no? So example of a problem tree, this is in Vietnam. So ang effect daw na ay namatay, naguba ang barko, nawala ilang mga tanom, mga balay naguba, unya ang ilang tubig dayon nagsaline intrusion na, nag-saltwater intrusion. So these are all caused by typhoon, no? Or typhoon damages nila caused by typhoon. Pero ngano nahitabo man ni siya. So naadayon, no? There is community not prepared, destruction of mangroves, mo na ang nangahitabo, etc. So it's still connecting, no? It's still systems thinking, trying to actually go down to the root causes of the problem, no? Which is important. So mo na ang root causes giday marginalized and poor community. Wa giday ni sila naatiman. And to find solutions, taman lang din atong midterm, but later on to connect this after midterm, it's basically find, no, solutions tree dayon. So if you have problem tree, you get a solutions tree. And basically, as I've said, it's just the opposite, no? It's just the opposite. Sa deaths, you have saved lives. Ang boats destroyed, boats protected. Less na ang typhoon damage. Of course, the hazard, the typhoon is still there. Na magyapon ang hazard, no? Ingon ana. But here, the communities are now prepared. Kaya na sila warning system, kaya nag-invest naman ang gobyerno nila, tungod kay ang gobyerno maugyod ang ilang agenda, no, or the people themselves, no, are very much engaged, dili sila marginalized, empowered sila. So things like this, no, you can also do this, but as I've said, kini is more on after midterm na ni siya. Karon sa midterm nato is really on the problem analysis pata, no, or the vulnerability assessment. So morning other tools, no, that you can also try to use. We'll probably give more examples next meeting. So now I will ask a question, no? For example, if this is the person, no, we are looking at trying to hop or jump, is this person, or will you be vulnerable or at risk? Come on, kamo lang be. Review lang nato gamay kay mag-adto naman din ta sa risk, no? Mo depart na ta from vulnerability to risk. What do you think? Kini siya nga tao, is he vulnerable or is he at risk? Sige lang, anyone, di bitaw ko makita kitsa ng storya. Any idea?
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable, no? So ngano ka vulnerable siya, no? Kay pero kung maingani ang picture, no? I will go to the next slide. Is he vulnerable or at risk?
At risk.
Murag mas simple siya ang sira, no? I don't know, kung sa inyo, I cannot read your mind, of course, no? So I can only interact if you also interact. But this one is quite not sure, no? It's uncertain. Unsa ba tong gasturyahan ani? But kini kay klaro kay siya nga at risk gid siya, no? Murag mas at risk to falling. So that's why it's very important that risk is context specific, no? And vulnerability is hazard specific as well. Kung kini may ka at risk nga mahulog siya. Klaro kay nga mahulog siya. Kini dili mo gusto siya sure nga kani at risk, di ba? When say at risk, it is a probability of something negative to happen. So mahulog siya, so at risk siya. Whether he or she is not vulnerable, then we have to investigate that, no? Kung kuan ba ni siya, jumper ba ni siya daan, or kanang frail ba ni siya nga tao na vulnerability na niya. Pero kung ingon ani, well, pwede masad siya at risk ka madamag lang, pero marag dili kay klaro unsa gid atong problem. So that's why it's very important, no, kung maghimo na mo sa inyong midterm, maghimo tag risk assessment na dayon and risk analysis, it has to be made clear what is the problem we are trying to solve. No, unsa yung issue? Sa issue ani, at risk to what ni siya, no? Mo na ang importante para mas klaro atong analysis. And maybe makain ka vulnerable ni siya, no, mas na-answer ninyo kaysa at risk, because vulnerability, no, is actually a pre-existing condition of the element. So mo lugar ni atong element, no. So whether kini nga tao is luyahon or dili man galing, so usually ma-identify na nato ang vulnerability kay nag-pre-exist naman siya. Even if wala kita kabalo kung unsa nga hazard ang atong giistoryahan. As I've said, example, ang kang poverty, no, pwede gina siyang cuts across ka earthquake ba na nga hazard, flood ba na nga hazard, landslide nga hazard, pwede gid siya magamit nga vulnerability. But of course, there are also specific nga vulnerability, no? So mao na balikan lang gid nato, no, para dili lang maklaro unsa. I hope no masugod na ka clear unsa man ang vulnerability ug unsa ang risk, di ba? Risk is the probability of this negative impact to happen, like this person falling, while vulnerability is the pre-existing condition of this person who no might be able to cope or not cope when he jumps, no, because luya day siya daan, kusgan day siya daan, etc. Okay? So let us just review. As I've said, vulnerability, ako yung balik ko, no, are the conditions determined by physical, ingon ana, which increase the susceptibility of the individual. And it pre-exists the existence of hazard. Bisag wala pa ang sunog, for example, ang baha, naana na siya daan. While disaster risk, if we recall, ito na po na mention before, is the potential loss. So muna ni siya, no, probability of loss na ni of that negative impact to happen, no? And of course, it is determined as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. So sagol na ni siya. So karon atong sabtan unsa man ni si risk assessment, humana man ta ni vulnerability assessment, no? So it's a qualitative and quantitative or so pwede siya qualitative, you just narrate it, you describe. Pwede siya quantitative, meaning imo yung i-compute na kay index, na kay score, na kay number of persons affected nga pwede ma-predict, no, to determine the nature extent of disaster risk, katulaging risk, no, by analyzing, again, no, analyzing and evaluating. So dili lang siya nga i-analyze as in, for example, you compute, no, nga pila ang degree, kinsa man ang mas riskier ani, kini level 2 lang, kini level 3. Mana analyze, no, usually quantitative ni siya. But more important is we're able to evaluate atong ma-articulate, may istorya nato, no? Nya maingon ta nga therefore kini ang atong unahon. So dili lang siya by numbers, but there is a story about this, no? Evaluating the existing conditions of the exposed element, of course, and the vulnerability that could harm the people, etc. So mo ni siyang risk assessment. So according to UUNDRR, it includes hazard. So mo na, no, gi-characterize ang hazard, mo gina atong giuna sa prelim, and the analysis of the exposed element. So mo na sa prelim nagstorya na mo unsa ang inyong site nga gipili, unya ang hazards nga na dito sa site, dugangan din na nato karon sa vulnerability and sa capacity nga mga assessment para makumpleto na gid nato ang usa ka scenario, no, or maybe several scenarios, mo nang gitawag nato nga risk assessment na dayon. Okay? So next meeting we will also give more example, but later on I also give you a very familiar example, no, para ato gyud musunok ni, no, ma-understand unsa man ang risk assessment. Okay? Before I go to examples, there are sometimes later on you might hear some people saying dili man risk analysis man dapat, dili man risk assessment. So unsa man gid ni siya, no, napay gitawag nga risk management. But basically risk management is already after midterm, no, after you understand the risk then you manage it, no. So and probably you even reduce it mo na nga na DRR nga gitawag. So unsa man gid ang difference sa assessment ug analysis? Well, there are several papers and I'd like to cite, no, Susano and Mulyono saying that actually ang risk management is the entire thing. That's because that's what we want to do, nga ma-manage na to ang risk. Kaysa una man good, we just or people just manage disaster, kanang magkaguliyang na, nanay na nga igo, nanay na nga samdan, i-manage na nila, pero disaster na ilang gina-manage. Karon gusto na to mas proactive ta, let us manage the probability of it happening. Mo na siyang gitawag risk management, di ba? So it has several meanings, but it's associated with obtaining insurance coverage or risk transfer. So kana no, daghan ang purpose nga no gusto nimo i-manage ang risk before it even happens. But that is after midterms, as I've said, no? Ang ato karon risk assessment and risk analysis. Unsa man ang difference, no? So it is very clear in this table that when we talk of risk analysis, more on the calculation part, no? Tanaw pud nimo ang consequence or the frequency, meaning for example kini siya nga risk, unsa man siya mahitabo every year ba ni siya nga risk? So mo depend na rin sa himong hazard characteristic. That's why hazard identification is also here. Of course, wala ang exposure sa picture because it is already assumed that you know what element are you analyzing. Kaya of course, may ka nga kini nga mabahaan nga napulo ka balay, based man ni siya sa ingani kadako nga baha. Kung kana nga baha, mahitabo man guna siya every 10 years lang. So mo na ang naay mga probability or frequency, no? Mga na mahitabo. So you calculate that. As to whether you accept that risk, you tolerate that risk, or you do something about that risk, or which risk to prioritize, dito na siya mo ng assessment nga part. So basically, although uban tao mulalis sila nga ang analysis mas broader kaysa risk assessment, but I espouse this idea, no, that risk analysis is the micro, risk assessment is the meso, and risk management is the macro nga lens na dayon. Okay? And this is not just alone, no. This another paper saying this, no, by Liu et al. 2010. So mo no, ang risk analysis nga part, of course, part ana is you know the scope and the objective. Kaya kabalo ka unsa lagi ang problema. Unsa gid itong problema ani no? Unsa man at risk. So you identify the hazard, ingon ana, and some scenarios. So mo na you try to estimate na yun the risk. Pag-evaluate nimo mo lagi ni tolerate ba nimo sa mga option, that's the risk assessment part. Ang management dayon kini na kana unsa nimo reduce gid na siya, no? So anyway, I'll give you the link of these papers on e-learn, no? If you want to read more, you can also read these papers. There is one last, no, risk assessment by, this is even a book, no, by Wiley, saying that analysis is really just here, no, and it's part of the risk assessment process. So mo to hazards, determine the consequence, ang risk picture. So that's risk analysis. But when you start to tell the story about this, about the people, how is it that they become that way, for example. So even alternative measures, ingon ana mo na assessment na appeal na siya sa assessment, no. So dili lang mapa bitaw kun dili istorya nimo unsay nahitabo, unsay meaning sa mapa, mo na siyang risk assessment. So that's why I prefer risk assessment. Of course, if you control dayon ana, and even if you communicate the risk, no, so that people will know, that's how we manage risk na dayon. So mo na ang mga framework, no, para di lang ta ma-confuse no sa ang risk assessment ug risk analysis. So I inserted here Einstein, no, before we go to more examples, saying that is Einstein mismo na ingon that if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. No less than Einstein is saying that. Mo na nga dinhi no, we understand the problem, we assess. But of course, it also starts on what is really the problem. Mo gina, no? So unsa man kinsa ang at risk? At risk to what? And why is it even important? Mo na nga mo gina nga mga question akong gi-ask during prelim, no? Of course, during your midterm, you can still improve them, no? Enhance them kung or make them a focus pag yun nga part, no, kung wala medyo broad pa tong kuan kay lisod man kayo kung mag-analyze ka na dili klaro ang problema. So mo to, no, risk assessment is a very big part yun of our subject mo na up to midterm risk assessment kita unya kanang mga kuan dayon after midterm na mga unsay himuon kay matud pa ni Einstein, he would spend no 55 minutes understanding the problem or thinking about the problem and ang solution later on na kung maklaro na to ang problema. No less than Einstein himself. Okay? So let me just crystallize this. A comprehensive risk assessment not only evaluates the magnitude and likelihood. Mo man ang analysis nga part, no? Kanang makuan mo lak mas kulba diri, la kulba ang bagyo dinhi. Napulo gid kabuk balay maigo ingon ana, no, mga likelihood, potential risk, but also provides full understanding of the causes and impacts. Mo ang importante, no, nga ngano ingon ana. That's why balik sa vulnerability kato mga root causes, etc. Risk assessment therefore is an integral part of decision and policy making, no, and planning. Of course, sa mo plano kung wala ka nakasabot sa unsay problema. Okay? So this is just an example, no, of what we've been doing in XU and Manila Observatory. Pwede din siya, ang risk assessment, pwede regional, tibok Pilipinas, by region dayon, pero pwede sa siya by city, no? Depende. Basta bahala ka by city or by municipality, nagi ng hazard, exposure, vulnerability, risk, and even impacts, no? I've already defined risk is the probability, impacts are probably the damages, no, and other than that damages, the long-term damages or effects, no, mo nang i-define na nato last meeting. And we can also do that, no, whether that's agriculture, construction, medical, education, etc., no, and we can even connect some of these because later on we realize nga ang pwede na himuon sa construction kay pwede sa na siya makakuan sa medical, no, nga pwede siya kana nga project kay ka nga dapat maghimutag sakto nga tulay ngon na dili mabahaan. So, sa construction lagi na siya nga concern. Pero sakto no during the pandemic ang mugamit gyud sa tulay para mahatod ang tambal og vaccine. So daghan kayo no nga pwede dayon imong project daghan no, hitting more birds no in a stone, for example, as the saying goes, no. So management actions na. But I've said kining planning is after midterm ang ato karon ani diri sa no sa risk assessment nga part. But no, before I go lagi to examples, napakoy isingit gamay no because for quite a time, by the way, are you still there? Hello? So, nakatulog na mo.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Ako, I will consider myself no in the DRR nga kanang group no. I'm more into the DRR nga mga practitioner no. Nasa tay mga kauban nga sa climate change gyud no, nga mga IPCC kini UNDRR man ko mas na associate gyud kini sa Climate Change Commission, yung mga physicists nila usually. Kini usually daghan pod mga engineers dinhi. And sometimes gailog no, and we understand nga na ay mga framework, na ay mga formula kay basin naa sa inyo makatrabaho later sa government. Nya ngano lahi man to ilang ko, di man to mo giingon ni sir no. So that's why I will explain that here because usually during katong face to face pa, this is my job no kung magkagubot hindi magkasinabot ang mga mga taga Department of Agriculture nya nada yon ang mga army, so ako ang mo explain no nga this is actually the framework, so dili lang ta mag-away no. So as I've said, there is what we call risk reduction, and most often kinigid ang akong gistorya no nga mga earthquake na risk assessment, and of course long history kay taas naman kayo ang history sa unsay nga landslide, unsay mga earthquake ingon ana. But of course napud sila risk assessment no. Nya napud sila lahi nga mga formula ani no, nya mas bag-o ni sila. We understand because climate change is also evolving. Di pa ginato masabtan unsa gyud no. That's why we need projections gali no, not just the past. But of course there are convergence points here no. Nga ingon ana. For me, I take climate change as really hazard no, a hazard or a trigger or exacerbating the hazard like floods for example or droughts. Mo gid na akong stand na ever since more than 10 years ago. Pero ang uban murag lahi gid ila no. But let's see what happens. Tinuod nga nasay credit no, naay merit by the way ang kanang mga climate scientists, because if we see for example in the last 40 or so years, ang kasagara giday disaster is meteorologic or hydrologic related no sa kada tuig. Kung kita ka og blue, green, kining pula, while about orange, mo na sila ang mga occurrence good of disasters of late no, lately. Nya bisan ang wildfire, pwede gyapon ma-considered ang landslide gani kay na may rain induced, ang earthquake amo na mga geotechnical ana no. So magkakadaghan gyud no ang mga weather related. So mausad nga dapat gyud istoryahan no ang climate no, dili lang murag maglahi gid sila og science lugar kay bag-o gid daw ni. In another graphic no by National Geographic, so tanawaw ang mga disaster daw since 1980 to of late mao ra gid ni halos no kana mga earthquake, tsunami, volcano halos nag-maintain ra sila no. Ang number, these are number no of earthquake, dili man ni siya in terms of death lugar or damage. Pero ang mga in terms of kuning climatologic, hydrologic, meteorologic, wa na ga-increase gid sila. And so that's why no wonder nga nagi mga scientists nga mas nga ipaburan na gid ni lahi ginig formula siguro no. We understand that their concern as well. And so that's why I like to show you no some these are older slides. Kendra and is actually professor in physics, no, environmental science in ADMO, and of course the legendary Rosa Perez, no, kauban ako sa uban uh, training. So this is the nexus saying that okay, mo ra man gyud unta, no, ang sa ato sa DRR, risk, likelihood, hazard, mo na siya ang kuano, physical disturbance or katong bagyo lugar. Ang elements exposed, so mo ni sila, no, affected by the hazard. Ang vulnerability and napagitay adaptive capacity, some will divide that, no, or uban i-minus na nila ang ilang formula ana. However, according to IPCC, the kanong kuan sa ilang AR4 is actually the sorry, no, the assessment report number 4 back in the early 2000. So lahi sad ila, no, kay ang exposure nila, ang pag-define na sa exposure kay nature and degree to which a system is exposed. So lahi, no, so lahi nya nas lagi dugang nga sensitivity, the adaptive capacity is a function of vulnerability. But of course, we do not go to the details of this, no, kay mo ni ang ilang kuan sa una. So mo na naglibog na nun ang mga LGU or mga gobyerno, abi na mo exposure kay ang tao. Nya karon kay the degree to which a system is exposed man di ay, no? For example, mo ni, no, ang definition sa IPCC 4 or sa AR4 sa una, no, nga ang imong sensitivity nga gitawag to whether you are fair skinned or kay example, di ba, mas dali man gyud ma-sunburn or at least makita nato ma-sunburn kung kanang medyo toned ang skin, no, compared sa kanang very fair ang skin. Of course, makita nato. While ang exposure nila, tanawa, dili man ang tao itself but the strength of the sun's ray. Tanaw nimo kung very kuan ba init ang adlaw karon or basin gabunon, or the number of hours under the sun. So lahi, no, dili lahi ang atong kuan sa exposure definition. And of course adaptive capacity, mao gyapon sunscreen, taning lugar. So mao ni siya ang mo describe dahil sa vulnerability. So mao ni ingani ila sa una, no. So that's why ako nag-struggle gid ko for pila ka years nga ma-identify, ma-marry ni, no, unsa ang gusto sa mga climate scientists ug kami sa disaster science nga ang hazard of exposure medyo nausa siya for the climate scientist at that time, no, and the vulnerability here we try to connect. So maayo na lang in the 2019, at least in the Philippines mismo, ay nag-adapt na gyud sa Pilipinas, no, ang IPCC assessment report number 5, which actually changes that confusion, no. So ang mga climate scientists karon ni sugot na lang gid sila sa kami, no, sa disaster science nga ingon ato na lang ning usahon para dili maglibog ang mga tao. And that's why, as I've said, this is in AR4. So wala na ni, scrap na ni, no, kung naa magaling makiglalis sa inyo igna, wala naman gihimo na sa Pilipinas nga dili na ni gamito ng AR4, no, nga ang vulnerability na dito exposure kay makaguliyang ni, this will confuse people. In the AR5 it's already like this, no, hazard. So kung nakay climate there, it's part of the hazard part, no. And of course kung nakay emissions kay wala nimo gi-govern, of course that will also add to climate, ingon ana. And to summarize, again, I will send you the link of this, no, para mabasa ninyo. As I've said, to summarize, AR4, ang exposure, ilang definition of exposure is part of vulnerability, nalisod kay na, no? While karon sa AR5 or Assessment Report 5 of the IPCC, ang climate, na nagyadya ang hazard, na na-expose element, vulnerability, nagyapon sila mga definition of sensitivity, ingon na, but it's now part of vulnerability and that will constitute the risk. So at least, no, dili na gubot unsa day ang exposure ani. Wala na tong unsa ka kadugay sa sun. Importante kay nabulad ka sa sun, for example. To identify more, so I don't know, I hope you're using your laptop kay murag gamay kay ni siya kung sa imong phone. So sa una kato exposure lagi mao ni siya, pero wala na, gi-appeal na siya karon, no. Part na siya sa hazard. Ini mga ingon ani kung unsa ka init ang sun, for example, so hazard na siya. Ang exposure is really just the population, whether that's agriculture or your fisheries, for example, and that will constitute the risk. So this is just to make sure, no, that we will not be confused if we are faced with these frameworks. Okay. Finally, as I promised, I will talk about SIDRA very quickly, no. Basig na agad makatrabaho sa inyo, and we talk about the CDRA. So SIDRA is basically the climate and disaster risk assessment. So mo na nga para dili sad magmahay no ang mga climate scientists, hala sige ato na lang gyud ning tawgon og climate and disaster risk assessment. SIDRA na gyud ang tawag ani. Okay? So para dili lang disaster risk assessment. So basically ang himuon ana is you characterize gyapon or the hazard mo gyapon no, intensity etc. But of course with climate projections now kay basin mas kusog na ang ulan ang bagyo sunod no ingon ana who and what na yun imo exposed elements. So basically these two you have already done and pwede gyud dugangan ninyo climate dayon nga mga perspective no during your midterm. Kini atong lesson good after prelim which is vulnerability assessment. And of course, you can be vulnerable due to climate change as well, di ba? So, but of course, we also highlight the capacity part. Kini dayon, these are just some features of SIDRA kung kini sa gobyerno gyud na slight influence and change assessment. Basically, this is the systems map that we are talking about, no? Nga kinsa man ang ma-influence sa unsa nga parameter. So mo na ni siya and the impact dayon. Of course, you will see the impact if what you will do to other things. Pero ato taman na ta sa risk, no? Dili na necessarily maghimutani because that is already component there. In government planning, no, mao ni ang mga phases nila. So mag risk map gyapon ang mga LGU, local government unit, na gitawag nila nga impact chain. Basically that is the connectivity, no, mo na chain ang tawag hantud makahimo din ka. So this is just for government, no, mo lang ni ang mga steps para makahimo gid og plano atong gobyerno. So magamit ni atong i-discuss diri. This is another way of looking at it, no? Daghan magud mga one office sa government, but basically it's the same, no? It's here climate change vulnerability assessment. Anya so mato na climate unana po sa disaster dayon para klaruhon lang gyud no nga climate because mao lagi kato inyong gihimo nga hazard characterization usually mo belong to siya diri sa DRA. Wala magoy projection adto kato nga mga baha based from historical man to asa ang bahaunon ingon ana. But if we really want to talk now about climate change na dapat unsa na ang senaryo sa baha. So mo lang na ang difference no nga mo na ang mga climate scientists would really insist nga nagi climate nga assessment dili lang tong usual nga DRA, which of course I also agree, no, until you get your findings. I know this is quite a handful, no, but basically this is just to say kana ang gobyerno nato na nagitawag nga comprehensive land use plan, balaod na siya, no, kanang asa dapit ang mga future nga housing, asa dapit ang future nga business area, and I am involved, no, at least for CDO in some of the activities here. So basically as CLUP kanang plano nga unsaon pag-use ang land, no, kay land use plan will really entail, no, SIDRA. No? Na si SIDRA diri oh. Dapat mag-SIDRA gyud ka, SIDRA para maka-proceed ka kung unsa gyud ang zoning ordinance, no, ug ang comprehensive land use plan. So clearly, no, para ang atong plano sa city is really based from science, based from hazard. Dili na nga magbalay dito na nga landslide ra gihapon. So sayop, di ba, ingon ana. So mao ni siya ang flowchart, no, just so you will know. And that's why we can also call this as the integrated na din nga risk assessment. Basically, mo na siya ang CDRA, no, SIDRA. Ipangbutang, no, pwede pagali ibutang diri ang pandemic na dayon, no, karon. So here so appeal now an increase in temperature, changes in rainfall. So mo na tong gaigno, no, nga mga climate change ba. Ang mga climate scientists gusto nila i-appeal gini siya. Dili lang ang kanang existing or kanang nakit-an lang nato from hazard hunter, no, dapat i-appeal pa ang mga climate projections so that you can assess risk all the better. Okay? Okay, may example na rin ta, no? Do you have any questions before I go to example? I will make this as simple as possible, you know, atong risk assessment. Any questions? Ibig no, wala may matubag. Yes or no?
Wala na, sir.
Wala lang, padayon ko ha. Padayon ko. Can you see this? Kaning for example? Uy.
Wala, sir.
Wala?
Oh, sir.
Ano ka ni ba? Lang ako Uy, yung makita, ano? Gamay ra lagi mo karon, no? Asa ka tong uban ba? Okay, let's try this. How about that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Nana, sir.
Of course, no, bisag unsaon gyud, bisag unsaon pa natog spend time sa framework, lahi ra gyud kung na example, no. May sample gyud ba, no? Sige. Ay example ani, no. Mag-sample ko sa dalan, no. Kanang motabok ta sa dalan ba or na sa inyo ga drive man gyud, of course sa dalan mo ga drive, so maday inyo ga drive-an, di ba? So, example. So unsa man gid ang scenario? Di ba yung kung ang risk gali is scenario man siya kay probability man siya, no? So kana mag-build ka ba unsa ka ang posible mahitabo? So it's a scenario. So for example, naamotabok ka sa dalan, ala at least ka kumaligsan simba ko, no? Atong in this context, paminaw mo ha, ang this context, so ang hazard nato kini lugar na ay cycler ganang ka bicycle, no? Ingon ana cyclist kay kanang ikaw maigo man ka, so ang one bicycle every 5 minutes, so muna siya ang frequency, so mura bagyo yung return period of 5 minutes, so muna i-characterize na nato ang atong hazard. But of course, kabalo na tadaan kinsa ang exposed element. Mo na ko ingon, no? Kabalo ka kinsa di ay ang na-expose ani. Nya unsa ang problema? Dapat klaro sa imo unsa ang problema. Ang problema is gusto ko mo tabok, or di man sa problema, no? Ang issue is gusto ko mo tabok nga di ko maligsan, di madisgrasya. Of course, mo na ang risk nga atong gusto i-analyze. So, mo na scenario 1. Basin kung kini klase nga scenario, ang likelihood, no, ang likelihood nga mobalik si hazard kay low man, talagsa raman, no, every 5 minutes raman, and simbako kung maigo gyud sab ka niya, grabe na timing pa gyud, low rasad basin gali ang gabisikleta pa hinon matumba dili ikaw. So mo na mo intang the risk is low. Ana, no, para sugod na tag-analyze sa risk ba, no, nga na makuha na nato mo nang risk analysis, gi-analyze nato ang risk. But of course, I'm telling you this as a story. No, mo na nga assessment gid siya, dili lang siya analysis nga plus minus low risk or ana. Now I'll give you another scenario. Kini be, ang kani nga scenario mas daghan na ang labay nga bisikleta. If ka gusto gyapon ka motabok, what do you think is the likelihood? Low, high, medium, or low pa ba ka? Come on, be, tingog sad mo.
Medium, sir.
Medium siguro, no, or high ingon ana lugar. How about ang consequence ani? Low ka gihapon kung na bisikleta makaigo sa imo, lisod sa kay no, kadaghan kay bisikleta. Pero basin ma-consider nato low gyapon. So let's just say nga high ang likelihood kay daghan kay bisikleta. Unya ang consequence maigo ka basin lagi ang matumba pa hinon ang bisikleta. So maybe ang atong risk adto is medium dayon, no? Atong risk kay high and low man siya. Example lang ni, no? Stress storya man ta din, di pa man nga ga-scoring gyud ta. Unless i-scoring mo ni, pwede niyo magamit gyud sa kuano kanaga transpose study, pwede gyud kanyo magamit, no, nga unsa di ang risk nga ang safety sa pedestrian, for example. Another one is ingon ani na naay truck na pud every 5 minutes, so ang likelihood siguro low gyapon. Pero simba ko kung maigo ka ng truck na kulba kay na og consequence, no? So low ug high, so possibly medium dayon, no? Ang kuan na pud nimo kay anang depende sa imong priority mo na nga pag-abot dito sa assessment, as I'm saying, dili lang ni siya low or high. Imo gyud i-assess nga la kung maigo ka og truck, unsa man na siya kanang patay or kanang masamad lang ingon ana na mo ikaw na din ang mo assess, no, i-tolerate ba nimo, imo bang himuan something, so mo na ang assessment nga part. Now let's do in a scenario like this nga daghan kayo truck galabay, unya dagko pa gyud kaayo, so kana posible high risk gyud ni siya kay motabok ka og highway ba nga dagko kay ang truck, unya paspas kay mo dagan kay daghan kay sila, na pwede high risk gyud na siya. So I hope, no, nga na kuan na sugod na mas nasabtan ninyo ang concept of risk, no? It's scenarios basically based from probability, identifying what's the problem, what's the issue, and we are of course talking about a particular element here. Of course, ang imong vulnerability and capacity karon tan-aw sa nato, dili ba lubak-lubak ang dalan na madamag na hinuon ka, dili ba ka kanang kakalakaw ba ka og ayo, baka gi-arthritis o baka gasungkod, for example, no? So mo na imong vulnerability and capacity, you have to also assess that. In any case, some will actually no, so makita nato daghan, so we can now visualize risk, and there are a lot of probability lagi that could happen because the hazard is not constant, no? Pwede paspas ang bagyo usahay, kusog kay ang bagyo usahay, hinay ra man sad ang ulan. So mo na ang mga probability that could happen. And for some, they are actually using a risk matrix. And you can use this, no? And it's fun, as I've said, no? Interesting. Pwede mo maghimo ingon ani. Kamo gyud, no? Ang akong kamo mag-vote unsa ang mas applicable sa inyo. So maghimo lang ka something like this is low to high nga consequence, unya low to high nga likelihood dayon. Para makaingon na kang low, medium, high bagyod, etc. And of course, you can create a story na dayon. What's really important, like as I've said in risk assessment, it's not just the scoring here, but you can articulate, no? You can tell the story of what are the main causes, the root causes, and later on what can be done, no? Dito after midterm. So example, so kung katong bisikleta lang, low man to og kuan lagi, consequence low likelihood, so mo na pwede low gid ang iyang risk, no? Pero kung daghan na sila, mo to natingon nga high likelihood kay daghan sila pero low ra gyapon ang consequence. Katong daghan kuan high ang likelihood, low gyapon kay usara ka track pero kulba kay ang consequence. Na compare nimo kung daghan kayo track so pwede gid kami kung high risk gid siya. This is where we can see na din nga low risk, medium risk, high risk di ay ingon ana, no? So this is one of a very simple way of analyzing our risk, no? And we are able to assess better if there are threshold values na low, medium, high ingon ana. But of course, in some examples, pwede gid ka nga criteria based, no? Criteria based. May ka nga dili gyud basta gani peak hours high risk yun na. There's a criteria. Automatic na dayon. Whether bisikleta ba na siya or truck na siya, basta kay ating alas 12 gani or alas 5 kay ting panguli na sa mga tao, automatic high risk. We call that criteria based. And that's okay, no? Kay mas kabalo man ka kung unsa gyud ang mahitabo sa dalan based from experience. So mao ni siya, no, ang atong risk assessment. So as I've said, pwede dayon maingon ani, no? So by difference ani. I think it's almost the same. So, ang uban pwede gani butangan nila og name gyud, no? Number pa gyud. No, ingana nga 5 times 5 times murag multiplication table ba. 5 times 1 is 5. Pero kung almost certain gyud ang mahitabo ni siya, no, kada minuto gyud mulabay daghan kayo track nya dagko pa gyud nga track, that's 5 times 5, that's 25. Pwede nimo na ako ingon, no, nga pwede data maka-scoring, maka-indexing na dayon sa atong mga map, no, mabutangan nato index like this. So this is as I've said, no, a tool which you can use, no, nga para nagyoy ma-color na dayon ang inyong kanang mapa lugar, no, sa GIS kay makabalo naman ka unsa ang red, unsa ang green, or even blue for example, for that matter. Now let's go to my last example for this morning, no, before we end. Kini siya nga bata gusto mo tabok, no, gusto siya mo tabok sa kuan ba dalan. Parehara sa ato, no, mo tabok ta sa dalan. So na siya question, mutabok na ko. So this is a risk question, di ba? Of course, that is a risk, no, mutabok ka sa dalan. Uy, napa mo diha? Kasabot ba mo Bisaya? By the way, please tingog kung naay dili kabalo magbisaya. Kay gusto na ko Bisaya. Sige.
Gets na, sir.
Anay isa, sige, ako na lang i-translate to English, no, although ang caption there is in because I really use this in training also those in the barangay. So this child is trying to ask, no, a risk question saying, should I already cross the street, no? Should I cross the street? And sometimes there might be assumptions, no? He is asking here, for example, if he could become faster than or cross the street faster than the car, no, or the automobile that is crossing also this street on the perpendicular side, for example. So muna siya makapas ka kog dagan nga di maligsan. Of course, alam mo dagan ka nga para maligsan, or mas paspas man tingali kumudagan kaysa ka kusog sa auto. Amo na mga kapayason nga tao, mo na ma-disaster, no. You're really thinking you're really faster than the flood or the landslide. There you go, for example. So this is a risk question. It should start with this. Now, what is the question? And then we apply HEVR. Let's try to see the scenario. First, we identify who. Kinsa ang at risk ani. So the identify exposed element. Or maybe you even have companions, no? So mga kauban nimo na in crossing the street, for example. And then in this case, the automobile may be the hazard, no? And therefore, it depends on how fast this automobile will will run or here, or how big the automobile is, no? So that's why we characterize hazard as is it a very big flood or is it a frequent flood but not so often, things like that. So we characterize. So muna inyong prelim. Karon vulnerability din ta. We need to consider the physical, social, even governance, and even environmental. So here example, no? Importante, V is a condition sorry, is a condition of the exposed element. Klaro na siya, your vulnerability describes the exposed element. Your vulnerability doesn't describe the hazard. Sayop na siya, no? But of course, V can be hazard specific, no? Dapat of course specific unsa nga hazard tong gasturyahan ani. So ang auto no mo na ang speed is very important here. So these are examples of the vulnerability parameters that you may want to assess. Naabay traffic light? Sakto ba ang dalan? Naabay pedestrian lane, for example? Naabay traffic aid, for example? Ingon ana, no? So mo na mga vulnerability and capacity if there are, no? Ang pwede nato i-consider. So kini as I've said, no, crossing the street, but you can apply already HEVR. But of course, as I've said, there is a goal, no? Ang risk nimo nga di ka maligsan, no? Of course, you don't get run over by the speeding car. And so, should we cross the street? So mo na din ni atong risk assessment nga part, no? Analyze nato, i-assess din nato. And we can, I hope our answer will be something like this. Yes, we will cross the street because stop na ang vehicle crossing light. So nag-stop na, nag-red light na ang para sa vehicle. And go na for the pedestrian crossing, for example, no? And we will pass through in the pedestrian lane, for example, di ba? So you will see here, the stop of the vehicle, this is basically to characterize the hazard. The pedestrian is the exposed element, and the crossing light and the pedestrian lane are the vulnerability or capacity nga mga parameters that we want to consider, no? Ingon ana. Of course, if it's very slippery, then that's another story. And we can say that, sige, mutabok na ta, no? So you can now decide. You are able to assess the risk, no? That now it is very minimal, unless of course there is a crazy driver running over on or speeding on a red light. Kana lahi na sa nga storya, no? So mutabok na ta ingon ana. But no, ano mahimo man og sidra? This is a story of disaster risk assessment, no? But the government now is really pushing climate and disaster risk assessment, because I think you will agree that the story will change if it starts to rain. Di ba? Ay kung mag-ulan na lahi na nga storya kay napakay payong, mahadlok pa ka nga madahila, basin bangilid pag yun ang very slippery ang atong dalan, na off pag yun ang traffic light kay nag-brown out kay kusog ang ulan. See, that is where the climate and disaster risk assessment comes in, and we call that the integrated risk assessment. And I hope in your midterm exam you really consider climate, no, nga mga inputs, not just the DRA nga katong the traditional or classical DRA, no. Kay I think you will agree kung muulan ni lahi gid storya ani, apil ang auto pwede gid sana dili maka-brake kay basin mas slide or things like that, no. So daghan dayon pwede nga scenario. Okay? So I will end with these 3 points, no. Last meeting I asked you about 3 points on vulnerability. For me, as I've said, remember that vulnerability is hazard specific, no? But we need to consider a systems lens, and that's why we introduced several tools about systems, no, approach, so that we can really capture and understand what's going on with the system which relates to the hazard. And finally, I would say that vulnerability assessment will teach us humility, no? Because if we do not know, no, where we are weak, then we cannot improve ourselves, and therefore we cannot be stronger, no. There is one beautiful story that one Jesuit was saying that the ultimate or the most precious gift of a human being is our ability to heal, because other inanimate object, maybe your ball pen or your ruler, or maybe even sometimes your laptop, when it gets broken, nabuak na gina siya, well, pwede man siya ma-repair. But naturally, a human person will heal, no? Naturally, even if there are scars. You can just imagine if we do not heal, from the many diseases and illnesses that we have, or even a scratch, or even from a broken heart, if we do not heal, how miserable can we be? But only if we accept that there is weakness in us, no? They say we can be stronger. And I end with that line, no? Saying vulnerability assessment is really useful, no? Not just for government, but even at the personal level. Before your questions, I would just want to say more examples next meeting, no? But there are no assignment this week because I already want you to prepare for midterm. Meaning anong prepare, magsugod na mo sa inyong group no nga unsa ka ang best nga tool no para sa atong midterm para dili mo maapektuhan sa midterm wala na ko naghatag og assignment no. So start thinking about your midterm, which is basically a disaster risk assessment. I will also give you guidelines on how to do that. Nagya po recommended readings dito sa e-learn. Okay, so we have around 20 minutes left no before our will now stop presenting. Any questions? That's the end of my input for today. Na mga pangutana. Hello?
None so far, sir.
Wala so far. Sige ha, so i-internalize mo ninyo. Of course, it's a handful, no? For about an hour, I've been talking about what's this thing, what's the processes. But ako ang key to really understand this is you can apply it in a personal level. And I think no, you will be able to gain better insight. Yeah, mas sharper na din inyong lens no on what vulnerability and risk are. Okay, I think that's for now. Kung wala question, then I will have to ask you to turn on your cam so I can take a screenshot of those present today. Hello? Aman ang uban nga naay mga kwan. Balo mo asa inyo mga classmate, murag mga napulo sila ka book or 11 wala diri. Sa man to sila ba mga groupmates man to ninyo? Sila gatunga, gabayad. Anyway, so smile lang yapunta. So haman ang uban si Paul wala, si Camille, haman mong Camille, smile din ta. Unya. Okay. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. Pero sa ikaduha, lagi ko mag-screenshot kay ready pang uban. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. Sige, goodbye. See you next week. Prepare for midterm. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Thank you, sir.